Today, class, we are going to read about the biggest pumpkin ever. And it is by Stephen Kroll, who is the author. Does anybody know what the author does?
Writes the words.
Writes the book, writes the words, yes. And the illustrator is by Jenny Bassett. Does anybody know what the illustrator is?
The pictures.
They draw pictures? Yes. Okay, so we have 3 vocabulary words that we're going to learn about today. And the first one is ripe, and that means developed to the point of readiness for harvesting and eating. So that word is ripe. Our next word is hummed, and that means to make a low, steady, continuous sound like hmm. And our last vocabulary word is peered, to look narrowly or searchingly, as in the effort to discern clearly. So like a teacher looking at her class, she peers at them. So, once there were 2 mice who fell in love with the same pumpkin. Has there ever been a time you fell in love with something that your friend did? A boy? Yes. Clayton the house mouse noticed it one day in the vegetable garden. It was still little and green, but Clayton thought he could make it grow really big. It might even get big enough to win the grand prize at the town pumpkin contest. So was the pumpkin already big enough to win the contest?
No.
It was still little. Desmond, the field mouse, discovered the pumpkin the same day. He thought that if he helped it grow, it could become the biggest jack-o'-lantern in the neighborhood. And a jack-o'-lantern is when you cut the pumpkin. So who finds the same pumpkin? Desmond? Yes. That afternoon, Clayton watered the pumpkin. He also mixed up some fertilizer of manure and water. He spread the mixture around the pumpkin to make it grow large. So what does the fertilizer do to the pumpkin?
Helps it grow large.
It helps it grow. It gives it nutrients. That very same night, Desmond went into the garden. He watered the pumpkin too. He also spread some manure mixed with water around it. So what's Desmond doing?
He's doing the same thing.
Yes, he's doing the same thing that Clayton's doing. Do you think they know this?
No.
The next day, Clayton watered and fertilized the pumpkin again. The next night, Desmond did the same, and the pumpkin began to grow. By the end of a month, the pumpkin was so large, Clayton couldn't believe his eyes. So why was the pumpkin growing so large?
Because they were both doing it.
They were both doing all the caring. My goodness, said Clayton's mother, and it's not even full grown. Clayton shrugged. All I do is water it, he said. Clayton's mother whispered in his ear, if you want the pumpkin to grow bigger faster, she said, you should use sugar water. That night, Desmond brought his brother Morris to see the pumpkin. Morris knew everything there was to know about growing things. That's some pumpkin, he said. Desmond shrugged. All I do is water it, he said. Morris whispered in his ear. You should try using sugar water, he said. So what advice did Clayton's mother and Desmond's brother give them?
Give it sugar water.
Give it sugar water to help it grow. The next day, Clayton dug a small hole beside the pumpkin vine. In the hole, he placed a bowl full of sugar water. He cut into the vine a few inches from the pumpkin. In the cut, he put one end of a piece of a candle wick, and then he put the other in the bowl of sugar water. That night, on the other side of the pumpkin, Desmond did the exact same thing. So what do you think the sugar water is going to do?
Make it grow really big.
Really big, you think? Within a week, the pumpkin was twice the size it had been. Within 2 weeks, it was absolutely enormous. That's a big pumpkin. Clayton was amazed. He ran down the road and peeked into his friend Jimmy's pumpkin patch. The pumpkin Jimmy was growing for the contest looked much smaller. Clayton scratched his head. I have an amazing pumpkin, he said out loud, and I think I'm going to win the contest. So how do you think Clayton is feeling right now?
Confident.
Confident? He's probably feeling really happy that He's going to have a big pumpkin. That night, Desmond and his brother Morris spent a long time looking at the pumpkin. How do you think it got that big? Desmond asked. Morris shrugged. A little luck, a little skill. It's going to make some jack-o'-lantern, said Desmond. It sure is, said Morris. A week later, Clayton noticed the pumpkin was bigger than the family car. During the day, everyone he knew came by to admire it. And at night, all the mice gathered around to do the same. Do you think Clayton and Desmond will ever find out about the other one helping the pumpkin?
Yes.
I think they do.
You think so? By now, summer was almost over. In a week, the pumpkin would be fully grown and start turning yellowish and then orange. A few weeks after that, it would be ripe and ready for the pumpkin contest. Clayton could hardly wait. The pumpkin was growing so fast it would soon be larger than his house. Then he had a terrible thought. If the pumpkin was so big, how would he get it to the contest? It wouldn't fit in his red wagon. It wouldn't even fit in a truck. Clayton decided to worry about this when the time came. So how do you think Clayton's going to get this pumpkin to the fair?
Roll it.
Roll it?
A helicopter.
A helicopter?
An airplane.
An airplane, that might be. That night, the weather grew colder. Thinking there might be an early frost, Clayton rushed out to the pumpkin with his blanket. One was not enough. Soon he was rushing back and forth, carrying all the blankets from the house. As he worked, he hummed a little song, and as he hummed, he heard someone else singing. He also began to realize that someone else was covering the pumpkin with blankets. Who do you think is covering the pumpkin with blankets besides Clayton?
Desmond.
Desmond. Desmond, too, had seen the danger of an early frost. He, too, had brought blankets for the pumpkin, and as he worked, he sang a little song, and as he sang, he began to realize that someone else was working and humming. Clayton stopped humming. He put down his pile of blankets and peered around the pumpkin. Desmond stopped singing. He put down his blankets and peered around the corner of the pumpkin. The two of them bumped heads and fell down. "You've been feeding the pumpkin," said Clayton. "And you've been feeding the pumpkin," said Desmond. "That's why it got so big," said Clayton. "That's why it got so big," said Desmond. They burst out laughing. When everything had been explained, Clayton said, "I know I'll win the contest if I can get the pumpkin to town." Desmond smiled. "I'll help you. Just let me carve the pumpkin into a jack-o'-lantern for Halloween when the contest is over." "It's a deal," said Clayton. "A deal," said Desmond, and they shook on it. So how did Clayton and Desmond come into an agreement?
They compromised.
They compromised?
They made a deal.
So one gets to take it to the fair and one gets to make a jack-o'-lantern. The morning of the contest was bright and sunny. Mice were bringing their pumpkins to the town square by truck and car and wagon. Some were rolling them along the ground. So Macy, you said rolling it, but his might have been a little bit too big for that. Suddenly, they all stopped short over the fields. Here came the biggest pumpkin anyone had ever seen. It was being pulled by 100 field mice on motorcycles. Do you think it took all these field mice to pull this pumpkin?
Yes.
When the pumpkin reached town, it was too big for any of the streets. Clayton had to explain why they couldn't bring it to the square. The mayor understood at once. He led the crowd to the giant pumpkin and pinned the first prize ribbon on its side. Then everyone danced around it. "Who would have believed this?" said Clayton as he danced. "Who would have believed this?" said Desmond at the same moment. When the celebration was over, the 100 field mice pulled the pumpkin back to the field. The day before Halloween, they carved it into the best jack-o'-lantern ever. And on Halloween night, its wonderful smiling face could be seen glowing for miles around. So what do you think the lesson or the moral of this story is?
Work together.
Teamwork,
Making a deal.
compromise, making a deal. That's good. Okay, so we're going to go back through our vocabulary one more time. Can anyone tell me what ripe means?
Ready to eat.
ready to eat, ready to harvest. What does hummed mean? A low, steady, continuous sound. And what does it mean when you peer something?
Look closely.
You look narrowly or closely. Okay, so for our activity, you're going to get a pumpkin and you get to decorate it like yourself. And then we're going to put all our pumpkins up on a poster and it's going to say, I teach the cutest pumpkins in the patch.
Oh.
So everyone can get their pumpkin and then create it.